Hi, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Nicole is going to kick us off. So, Nicole, go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll go ahead and start our program.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this very special post-election intra-pandemic online racial equity summit, a gathering of social justice advocates convened by Empower Missouri and co-sponsored by many community-spirited individuals, organizations, and agencies. I'm sad we can't all be together in person this afternoon, as we have in past years, but I want to commend our interim executive director, Dion Brown, and our policy and organizing director, Jeanette Mott Oxford, along with Sarah Olsley, Christine Woody, Molly Pearson, and our communications director, Rico Bush, who make up the amazing staff at Empower Missouri, for rallying to bring our annual conference online and with a much broader reach. I'm Nicole McCoy, president of Empower Missouri's board of directors, and we are so pleased to see that nearly 500 people have registered to attend this summit. I'm so happy you all are here. In these uncertain times, your engagement is an encouraging sign as we continue our journey to educate ourselves and each other about the real devastation of racism, and as advocates, strive to build communities in which all people will be safe to just simply exist. Empower Missouri works to secure basic human needs and equitable justice for every person in our state through coalition building and advocacy. We were founded in 1901 as the Missouri Conference on Charities and Corrections, but most of you may still remember when we were MASW, Missouri Association for Social Welfare. And though our name has changed several times throughout our 119-year history, our vision has not. We envision a Missouri in which all people have food, shelter, and justice. And as a board dedicated to walking our talk, I am proud to share that we have committed to adding a staff position at Empower Missouri that will primarily focus on the intersectionality of discriminations and disadvantages that are barriers to basic human needs and justice for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, also known as BIPOC populations in our state. We believe this is an important component to Empower Missouri's justice work, to highlight that equal isn't always fair, and to take into account that racism is a barrier to securing basic human needs and justice for everyone. So just a little about me. In addition to my volunteer service as board president, I am a Master of Social Work and Divisional Social Services Assets Manager and Housing Specialist at the Salvation Army Midland Division, one of today's co-sponsors. In my role, I represent the Salvation Army as owner of their housing developments, and I manage their permanent affordable housing portfolio and the relationships that come along with affordable housing development. And if you know, you know. And speaking of co-sponsors, I would like to thank our additional co-sponsors, and I'll also introduce you to today's MC. So first, let me offer our deep gratitude to the co-sponsors who helped to make this Racial Equity Summit possible. At the platinum level, Deaconess Foundation. And also at the platinum level, Maxine Clark and Bob Fox. We also thank these gold level sponsors whose contributions will help to strengthen Empower Missouri for the challenges of this pandemic, the economic recession, and the 2021 legislative session. Gold level co-sponsors are the Missouri Budget Project, Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice, the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, Beyond Housing, Operation Food Search, Missouri Kids First, the Salvation Army, Midland Division, Places for People, Sterling Bank, Buzzbold, Missouri Jobs with Justice, Journey to New Life. We also are thankful to these silver level co-sponsors: Chestnut Health Systems, Physicians for a National Health Plan, Gateway Housing First, Metro Organization for Social and Economic Equality, also known as More Squared, Kids Win Missouri, the NAACP Missouri State Conference, Missouri Coalition for the Environment, Mo Political Consulting, Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness, and Missouri Faith Voices. And these bronze level co-sponsors have contributed to this event and the ongoing work of our coalitions, and we thank them also. They are Mothers of Incarcerated Sons and Daughters, MISD, Kelly J. Berry, Bread for the World, St. Louis, Criminal Justice Ministry, Missouri Community Action Network, Missouri CAN, and St. Joachim and Ann Care Service. Thank you so much to all of our co-sponsors. Now, I would like to introduce you to our MC for today, Markea Watson, a fellow board member at Empower Missouri, whom I have had the pleasure of working alongside to continue the work of positioning the organization for the future. She is a trailblazer, an amazing teammate, and has been for me at times a wise counselor. Markea is a master of social work and the executive director at the Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness. Hailing from Los Angeles, California, home to one of the largest year-round homeless populations in the US, Markea recalls from her childhood feeling a sense of moral urgency to do something about this human rights crisis. This sentiment has been a driving force in both her personal and professional endeavors, and was her primary motivation to become a social worker. As a homeless advocate, Markea's goal is to engage community partners in open and honest dialogue about the conditions that cause homelessness and real-world strategies to end it. Markea, thank you for your service today and every day.
Thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. It's such an honor to join the Racial Equity Summit today as your MC. You know, normally Empower Missouri convenes its annual meeting in November as a way to educate on crucial public policy issues and build power for the sake of social justice in the legislative session that is called to order in Jefferson City each January. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, we could not safely meet face-to-face this year. So this online summit was devised as a way to make sure that we do not lose ground during these times of special challenges. The response has been tremendous, and we look forward to seeing what kind of good trouble we can all get into after this summit. To borrow the famous phrase from the late Congressman John Lewis, rest in power, John. Today, we will have a keynote speech by Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, a national thought leader in racial justice, community organizing, and movement building. I will share his complete introduction with you in a moment, but allow me to offer this brief overview of today's agenda. Following his speech, we will have a 20-minute question and answer period with Reverend Dr. Wilson. At the time that his speech ends, I will invite you to type your questions into the chat field. Empower Missouri's interns have agreed to monitor both the chat field on Zoom and the comments field on Facebook, where the summit is being broadcast via live stream. Those questions will be relayed to me, and I will voice them to Reverend Dr. Wilson for the sake of efficient time management and to reduce technological challenges around sound quality. After Q&A ends, Empower Missouri's 4 coalitions will announce the campaigns that they are leading in 2021 to promote social justice and racial equity and share how you may engage in these campaigns. Then, each of our platinum, gold, and silver level co-sponsors will have the opportunity to announce how you can get into good trouble with them in the coming months. Please stay with us for these calls to action because Empower Missouri and all of our co-sponsors need you if we are going to make progress toward building a racially just society. The calls to action will be offered in very brief videotaped clips, generally of 30 to 60 seconds, so please know we will make good use of your time and impart a lot of knowledge on you in just a few minutes. Also, as we close, you will receive information about how to receive continuing education hours for attending today's summit. A link will be posted in the chat box at that time. And now it is my honor to introduce you more fully to today's keynote speaker, Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson. Reverend Dr. Wilson is a pastor, philanthropist, and activist pursuing God's vision of community marked by justice, peace, and love. He is the current president and CEO of Deaconess Foundation and incoming president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, board chair for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and vice chair for the Forum for Theological Exploration. Reverend Dr. Wilson and his wife have 4 beautiful children and have been a blessing to the St. Louis area during the 9 years that he has led the Deaconess Foundation. We know that they will do the same for the District of Columbia as Reverend Dr. Wilson begins his new position with the Children's Defense Fund on December 7th. And with that, I welcome you, Reverend Dr. Wilson.
Thank you very much. I am grateful for the opportunity to be with you. I'm grateful for the chance to share with this remarkable community of advocates for children, for communities, for families throughout the state of Missouri and those in the wider area who may be watching on Facebook or online. I'm grateful to Empower Missouri for its remarkable work over the years. Some of those years in partnership with Deaconess Foundation is one of our funded partners and the folks that we learn with in community. You have indeed advanced the well-being of children and families in our community as you have done work throughout the state. And for that, I am ever so grateful. Of course, I have to thank the team at Deaconess Foundation, the board, the volunteers, all of the staff, the funded partners, including many who are gathered here, many who are sponsors for today's Racial Equity Summit, for the work that you do to center children in public policy conversations and to build the power to build a just community on their behalf. I give particular thanks and appreciation today to someone who has been a partner with me in each of the days that I've served the Deaconess mission. We joined the Deaconess community together in 2011, and now she serves as the interim president and chief executive. Cheryl Walker, a remarkable community leader, a remarkable champion for the state of Missouri, who will hold stead and provide advancing leadership to the Deaconess mission while the board is in search for its next permanent president and chief executive. Cheryl has been for us a board chair, a board president for the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing, an advocate at each and every level, and a dear sister and friend. And so I invite you to engage with her as she seeks to lead this mission to its next level in transition to its next leader. And finally, of course, I want to add my thanks to the Racial Equity Summit sponsors, of course, Deaconess being among them, and also, of course, the Clark Fox Family Foundation. I am grateful for the type of philanthropy that advances these conversations, that move us from advocacy to action in our communities. And so with all of that said, I am a bit daunted, quite frankly, and I want to correct the introduction, which said I am currently, that probably when I sent the introduction, I was currently the president and CEO of Deaconess Foundation. My last day was on Wednesday, and so I am most presently unemployed. And on December 7th, I look forward to joining the team to provide leadership of the Children's Defense Fund. With that note, I address you in what I've begun to describe as a moment of trial and transition. We come together here in this virtual platform on Facebook and on YouTube and other places in a time of trial and transition. At a Racial Equity Summit, it's helpful for us to remember and to be mindful, of course, that this year, 2020, is marked by the most significant expression of a global pandemic that we have seen in a century in COVID-19. Of course, in this time of trial, we understand it based upon the reality that COVID-19 has made plain and exposed the realities of that virus that has been impacting us for so many years, even coming into this COVID-19, the insipid virus of racial injustice that has been a part of American history, is systematized and systemic and structural racism that causes damage to little Black boys and girls, and in its anti-Blackness causes separation from and between humanity, from heart to heart and breast to breast. COVID-19 has met 1619, and it has caused in its wake an economic collapse, the likes of which we have not seen, has left 22% of America's children with an unemployed parent, has left the 12 million children that were already living in poverty before this moment, wrestling with what it means to be disconnected from the community of support, from the community of nurture that is felt when they go to school and receive 2 nourishing meals a day, when they access education without the need for the spotty internet that they may get in their homes if their neighborhoods are even wired for broadband. We have come to understand this year of trial by COVID-19, COVID-19, and economic collapse, and the expression and the deepening of the existential climate crisis that disproportionately impacts Black and brown people through environmental injustice anyway. We meet in a time of trial, but we also meet in a time of transition. And as much as this is also the centennial of the last great flu that we knew in our history, it is also, of course, in transition, the centennial of the women's suffrage movement. And in this moment of transition, we have elected the first woman to be vice president of the United States of America, the first Black woman, the first Asian woman, first Indian woman to stand in a seat so close to the center of power for the globe. This moment of transition when 151 million people and counting have voted in the most robust turnout for a presidential election in American history, 78 million and counting for a Democratic candidate, 73 million, even still counting, for a Republican candidate. This moment of transition, and yes, indeed, I know some people haven't accepted it, but it is still a moment of transition. Type at me, somebody. This moment of transition, which is and is becoming of administrations to the 46th president of the United States of America, is a time of trial. And while we honor the 78 million who voted for one candidate or the 73 million who had another opinion, I am reminded in this moment of trial and transition of the 74.1 million people who did not have a vote and did not have a voice and did not have a lobbyist because they are under the age of 18, and so they didn't get a chance to vote. the 74.1 million American children who require a voice in the political systems, yet they don't yet have the franchise. And so they are wholly dependent on coalitions like this one. They are wholly dependent on each and every one of you. And while we're talking about trial and we're talking about transition, while we will remember 2020 for the pandemic, or we will remember it for these uprisings of this summer in George Floyd protests, or we will remember it for the presidential election, I want us to pop a pin in this moment. 2020 is the first year in American history where the majority of those 74 million people under the age of 18, the majority of our children are non-white. Indeed, we are in a moment of trial, but we're also in a moment of transition. And I figured the 500 people who are gathered at a racial equity summit online in cyberspace and digital and virtual platforms ought to want to mark the fact that the demographics of our country are shifting, never to be returned to yesteryear. And thus, we must build systems for that going forward. It is in this context of transition that I make my own transition from service to the 640,000 children in the St. Louis metropolitan community, to serve all 74 million in America, advocating for them at the Children's Defense Fund. In this context of trial and transition, I've been asked to address the question to this body: what's next for justice? What's next for justice? This transition to this institution rooted in the contemporary civil rights movement and the children's advocacy movement compelled me to reflection on the past before projection on the future. And if I could go to the past for just a second, I have to remember that I have to think about what's next for justice beyond an election, beyond a presidential, beyond a gubernatorial, beyond a congressional. I have to think about what's next for justice by remembering what has already been for justice, because justice and its movements are bigger than any election cycle. Justice and its movements are bigger than any presidential election. Justice and its movements are bigger than the governor, than the Congress people, and bigger than our mayors. Justice and its movements are bigger than the politicians and even the public policy campaigns that we engage in. Justice is bigger than that. And so what justice has next is what justice has now. And what justice has now is what is embedded in justice's narrative from the past. And so I go back to the past and I think about lessons. I think about sitting down in Clinton, Tennessee at the feet of the Reverend James Lawson on Alex Haley's farm, run as a retreat center and training center by the Children's Defense Fund. And I hear Reverend Lawson, whom Dr. King called the ultimate architect of nonviolent direct action and teacher of the movement. I hear Reverend Lawson saying that what we call the contemporary civil rights movement is best known as the civil rights movement. No, I'm sorry, he says the nonviolent movement of America. He locates as its primary architect its history as the generation between 1953 and 1973. He notes that if we are intentional, then we see several movements within that 20-year movement. He sees the sit-ins as one movement. He sees the boycotts as another movement. He understands the expressions of students moving in one direction and churches moving in another, all as an ecosystem of action happening at the same time. If you listen very closely to this history, then it will resound very familiar. He sees from 1953 to 1973 this nonviolent movement of America. And I want to just point out to you as a point of reference, in that 20-year period, there were 5 governors in the state of Missouri. In that 20-year period, there were 4 U.S. presidents. Justice is bigger than elections. At the end of that period in 1973, the public policy director for the Poor People's Campaign, that mobilization to Washington, D.C., the woman whose apartment was indeed the address, the legal address for Resurrection City. That was the location of that mobilization. The woman who was the first Black attorney admitted to the bar in the state of Mississippi. The woman who graduated from Spelman College and then Yale Law School. That woman who represented the NAACP Legal Defense Fund during Mississippi Freedom Summer, Mother Marion Wright Edelman. In the end of the Civil Rights Movement in 1973, planted what was called the Washington Research Project and became the Children's Defense Fund. And the Children's Defense Fund has been advocating at the intersection of racial justice and child well-being for the last 47 years. Why do I point that out? Because the handoff from the civil rights movement to this institutional heritage that is imbued into the Children's Defense Fund is not just a point of pride for me as I make this transition. It's also a reminder that in the 47 years of work at this intersection of child well-being and racial justice, there have been 12 Missouri governors. There have been 12 US presidents, because justice is bigger than an election cycle, and justice is bigger than a president, and justice is bigger than a politician, and justice is bigger than elections, than their cycles, than the politicians, than the office holders. What's next for justice has already been for justice. And so I'll answer the question very quickly. If you remember nothing else, because I preach so fast or I talk so fast, I'm supposed to be keynoting and I'm actually preaching because I don't really know the difference. Remember this: what's next for justice is accumulating the power and political accountability to build the beloved community beyond this moment. What's next for justice is what has been for justice: building and accumulating the political power and accountability to build the beloved community. Well, I know, there I go, I'm using these theological terminologies and words. I know we all come from different traditions, so let me go ahead, back it up, press play, and dump it again. Let me say, when I talk about beloved community, I'm using the academic definition that Johnny Bernard Hill uses when he talks about beloved community. He treats Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. not just as a preacher or as a prophet, but rather he treats him as a systematic theologian. And what he says is that in King's articulations of beloved community, he's really talking about this. And it's helpful for a racial equity summit, so don't lose me on this. He says the beloved community is a multi-ethnic, multiracial community of peace and justice where love is the governing ethic. Y'all catch that? I talk fast. Let me say it again. The beloved community is a multi-ethnic, multiracial community of peace and justice where love is the governing ethic. I know we've got policy campaigns, we've got policy agendas. Those are helpful. They are necessary tools in a broader strategy, but beyond our tools, our techniques and our strategies, beyond our campaigns is a broader vision of making a new world. And I know I was asked, because it's not just Starsky who gets to preach one last time in Missouri. Nope, this is actually a keynote. So I got to be more specific and speak to immediate opportunities to build beloved community. I got some. I came with some. I want to talk about them in a minute, so I want to drop them here. And I see that my dear sister Jeanette J-Mo is dropping them in the chat. So let's talk about some immediate opportunities. Number one opportunity for building and accumulating the power and political accountability to build the beloved community for all of us is defining Biden's better. Defining Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s better. I know you've seen it. You've seen it on the placard in the campaign period, and somebody already caught it. So drop it in the chat for somebody else. The campaign slogan and logo in the midst of this period has been that we need to build back better. Can I tell y'all something? I'm gonna tell y'all a secret, because it's just the 500 of us. I'm gonna tell y'all a secret. Hearing about going back to anything is scary for Black and brown people, for whom there has never been an America that has built for our flourishing. I'm just gonna tell y'all that. I'm just trying to be honest. I ain't hating on nobody. The election's over. I know some people think it's not over. The Proud Boys think it's not over. It's over. But I'm gonna tell you, talking about going back is not helpful. In fact, it might be a hindrance for any of us who have been twice kissed by God's Son. And so we've got to do some work to help our president-elect to define what better means. We ain't gonna even deal with back. We're gonna talk about better. Let church say better. Somebody type in the chat, better. We're gonna deal with better, because there is the threat of an orientation of an institutionalist president-elect to moderate and mediate in order to get along with the 73 million people who voted for a white supremacist. In the interest of moving forward, sometimes we slow down and back up to try to allow people who don't want to move forward to get on with us. And unfortunately, what we find usually is that those people weren't coming no way. And so instead of worrying about back, we as advocates, we as organizers, we as activists, we as the prophetic expression seeking to help America live into the image and ideal of itself, and even to do better than that, have to focus on better. And this is the issue. I want to suggest, if we're talking about not going back, but going better and defining that for the incoming administration, then we have to recognize a couple of things. Can I tell y'all something real fast? Number one, we have to understand that this year in the presidential election, in the primary on the Democratic side, we heard, because of the organizing and advocacy work of the Children's Defense Fund and others at a national level, we heard the first question about child poverty in a presidential debate in 19 years, in a generation. We went, while 2 in 5 Black and brown children live in poverty in America, while 1 in 5 children in America live in poverty, while children are the most poor group of Americans of any demographic category, we went a generation without talking about child poverty at a presidential level. And getting inside that, let me tell you more. This is why we got to be clear about the fact that we've got to define Biden's better, is that some candidates early on engaged in the campaign with the Children's Defense Fund to help them define their agenda for children and families. They engage with them to make their platforms better. I'm pleased to say that Vice President-elect Kamala Harris was one who engaged most deeply. Her team engaged significantly, and her early agenda included much of the aims of CDF in her children and families agenda. I also have to tell you, unfortunately, that President-elect Biden's team is the group that did not engage. And so there's a question when it comes to children and families as to who is going to define the better. So in the context of these two responses, I want to suggest that it's up to us to reimagine child well-being, to be articulate about how we move forward, and to articulate it this way. Number one, children are the ultimate beneficiaries of our work for advocacy. They are. Ultimately, our campaigns are going to last multiple years, and so we won't be the ones to benefit. Our children will benefit. So child well-being must be the indicator of the country's health, and the well-being of children of color will be the ground to be contested as we talk about how we move forward. So I want to suggest that we need to have a wide-ranging and aggressive and assertive discussion about what better means. Better is embedded in the child welfare protections in the HEROES Act. Better in the investments that are invested in the investments for stimulus in the HEROES Act. Better is engaged in the child welfare protections, y'all got to check it out, in the BREATHE Act. Better has to do with advancing the legacy of John Lewis, not just quoting him, but actually advancing his life's work and passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. Better has to do with honoring the legacy of George Floyd and this young lady who stands with her fist in the air in front of an image of him in Minnesota because she is committed that there must be reform in policing. Yes, we got to engage in good trouble, and we've got to do it not just in the name, not just in the likeness, but in legislation that lives out the legacy of John Lewis, HEROES Act, BREATHE Act, George Floyd Reform and Policing Bill, John Lewis Voting rights bill. Yeah, we got to define Biden's better. I'm gonna get through this quickly. We got to define Biden's better, but we also have to push Parson on policy. Now, we got to deal with this the way it has been given to us. We find ourselves in a moment of trial and transition. We are grateful to have heard the advancements as it relates to the potential vaccine that is coming from Pfizer or from Moderna. We're grateful for that, but we also hear and recognize the slow pace of transition and sharing of information. And because we recognize that, we find, and all reports suggest, that the distribution of vaccines will have to happen based upon state level infrastructure. Y'all heard that? I'm gonna scare you again. The distribution of vaccine will have to happen, even if there is a national or federal mandate and policy, it will have to happen through state level infrastructure. And so COVID recovery is an area, an immediate opportunity where we've got to push Parson on policy about equitable distribution of the vaccine. And if the stimulus distribution is any indication of how the vaccine distribution is going to go, then we, my dear Missourians, have some work to do. Equitable distribution of vaccines will happen at a state level. We've seen the case study about the stimulus resources. It didn't work out very well. And we know that equitable distribution is going to have to give attention to vulnerable communities. We know that at least one of the vaccines requires 2 different administrations. And so getting to people, and people who are unhoused, people who have great need, people who don't have control over their own schedules, can't make those 2 appointments in the same way. And so we've got to make sure that mobile units, like the one that my wife leads for Children's Hospital, that mobile units, like the ones that Dr. Kendra Holmes at Affiliate Healthcare and our FQHCs are taking into communities to make sure people get COVID tests. We've got to make sure there's distribution through mobile units to get into communities that have needs. And while I'm here, let me just say this: teachers are essential workers. And so the allocation, the first allocation to essential workers, needs to include the educators in our public schools. We've got to push Parson on policy related to COVID recovery, and we got to keep pushing him in the midst of this spike on mask mandates and health closures. I know it seems he's not listening. I understand that he has been recalcitrant up to this point. I know he has been mimicking what we see from 1600 Pennsylvania and 46-1, but we've got to continue to push, because when we push, we get power, whether he reacts or responds or not. I didn't mean to go there. Let me get back to this. Yes, we got to push Parson on policy around COVID recovery. We also have to push Parson on policy on equitable implementation of Medicaid expansion. Y'all know he didn't want it in the first place. Y'all understand that he stood against it. And you are all wise enough to also know that Medicaid expansion and our dogged efforts to make sure that we got it onto the ballot, he used as a political tool to save himself by putting it onto the August ballot instead of putting it on the November ballot. Y'all understand all of that context. I don't have to map that for y'all. So let me just go ahead and drop it. Let me say the reason why I'm concerned about Parsons' policy on equitable implementation of Medicaid expansion is because I recognize that he already kicked 100,000 kids off the Medicaid rolls. He doesn't want any of the rest of us on it anyway. And so we've got to push on this policy. I could say more about defunding the public schools the way that Parson has. I could say more about defunding higher education the way Parson has. I'm not going to say that because some of y'all thought I was going to talk about defunding something else. I'm just going to suggest that if we're going to build the power, we're going to build the power and accountability to build beloved community, we got to define Biden's better. I'm going to say that we got to push Parson on policy, and I want to get into some questions. So I'm going to say this last thing. We've got to count our kids again. I went for a full year. I went across the United States of America trying with people like Laura Granite. She was doing this too. And people in community like Jim Burrsdale, they were doing this too. And people, people were asking us the question, what's up with Missouri? They didn't understand. They didn't understand in 2018, we had such national attention on our Senate race that people were wondering what's going on with the state of Missouri. Because after it was the case that they after it was the case that the race was over, that everybody's paying so much attention to, we lost a Democratic U.S. senator, but we advanced a higher minimum wage. We lost a Democratic U.S. senator, but we advanced in the same cycle, pushed back on right to work. We lost a Democratic U.S. senator, but we advanced medicinal marijuana. And people didn't understand what was going on in Missouri, and they especially didn't understand when we lost a U.S. A Democratic senator, but we advanced Clean Missouri in order to reform representation and competition at the state legislative level. And so people were asking in philanthropic circles and in justice circles, what's up with Missouri? How'd y'all do this at the same time that y'all did that? On the same ballot, how is it that this person lost and this initiative around electoral justice won? What's up with Missouri? So I spent a year talking to people about the ways in which you as organizers did critical work to assure that we paired kitchen table issues with justice and structural reform issues to get us to better democracy. I was glad, even to the point of boasting, about the ways in which you came together to advance an argument to make sure that we counted, that we put a professional demographer in place in order to make sure that we move first in the line of all states in how we were implementing and using the census. And unfortunately, this cycle at a 51-49 margin, we went from first to worst in the use of census data, allocating political representation and advocating and advancing democracy. And I want to speak specifically to one point that I take quite personally, this idea of an exact count that does not count non-citizens, that does not count children under the age of 18. And I take such umbrage with this passing, this dirty Missouri that passed in this election. And I'm gonna close at this point because I've got a 15-year-old son upstairs who is working in his virtual classroom. And that 15-year-old son worked this year on election day to make sure with Action St. Louis that people had meals when they stood in line at the polls. And that 15-year-old son learned democracy with the hundreds of volunteers who provided thousands of meals to people in community. And that 15-year-old son learns democracy and studying in his classes. And that 15-year-old son, if we stayed here in the state of Missouri, would be electing the next governor 4 years from now. But those who advanced the dirty tricks of dirty Missouri said that he shouldn't be counted in representation for the 7 years that he would actually be voting in the state. So we went from first to worst, and now we're the only state in the union that does not count our kids when it comes to democratic representation. And as one who has lived the last decade of my life in the work of child advocacy at the intersection of philanthropy and democracy and faith, that rubs me. I feel like I'm leaving with such significant unfinished business. So I got to tell you that we've got to count our kids. As we come to close, I want to say we got to count our kids for this reason. We got to count them because at some level we've betrayed them. I tell this story because of my birthday buddy. The pin that I have on my lapel is of James Baldwin. James Baldwin was born on August 2nd as I was. James Baldwin is the study of Eddie Glaude's newest book. James Baldwin, of course, contemporary African-American artist and poet. The story is told in the first chapter of Eddie Glaude's book about him, of the first time he ever met Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. He met him as a student at Howard University. And when he met him, he spent the day giving a talk there at Howard, and then he spent the evening, as I have spent some evenings with young activists in the St. Louis region trying to resolve all the issues of America. But I don't do it like this, but James Baldwin did. He did it with Johnny Walker Black most of the time. And so they had an all-night session resolving all the problems of America. And he got up to say goodbye to them on the next morning. And on that next morning, when he got up to say goodbye, he said that all of his work going forward would be about them. He said all of his work going forward, as he wrote, would be about them. He said all of the work that he would do going forward, he had to serve their agitation in the movement because they were already advocating and on the front lines. And he said if they were going to risk their lives for justice, kind of like these young people in the movement for Black Lives, if they were going to risk their lives for equity, kind of like these young people who are in the Ferguson uprising, if they were going to risk their lives to make America into something that is safe for Black people and brown people, then he had to serve them. And so the final words that he said to them as he said goodbye in their small apartment is, "I will never betray you." We've got to work to build the power and accountability to build beloved community, because in this final act of this election, in this ballot initiative, we have betrayed them. There are those who suggest that if there had been one more group out knocking on doors, masking up and knocking on doors, instead of just making phone calls, if there had been one group in St. Louis County focused on North County voters who are predominantly Black, if there had been the opportunity for people to outperform where people are canvassing and on doors, then perhaps we would have been able to hold a position where we counted our kids. And if we counted our kids would count. We'd be able to keep them in community instead of locking them up. If we counted our kids would count. We'd be able to have discussions about how we have them close to our hearts. I know it's time for us to have a conversation, but I want to be able to say, as I go forth and go into another community to serve this state's children, that I will never betray you. And because I won't betray them, I ain't gonna leave y'all alone either. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you, and I look forward to talking about what we can do to build the power and accountability to build God's beloved community for each and every one of our children. Let's talk.
Wow, thank you, Reverend Dr. Wilson. That was really powerful and inspiring. I have to tell you on a personal note that I find you to be quite the wordsmith, and I love an alliteration. I just love an alliteration. Put pressure on Parson, push Parson on policy. I love all of it. Now we'll have about 20 minutes of question and answer with Reverend Dr. Wilson, and I invite you to type your questions into the chat box on Zoom or into the comments section if you're watching live on Facebook. And so I'm actually going to kick us off with a question that I have myself. At the beginning of your remarks, you made a distinction between anti-Blackness and racism, and I'd like for you to discuss a little bit why it's important that we think of those two concepts differently.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that question. First and foremost, it's helpful for us to recognize that that racism, and I actually do believe in the work, and I commend the work of Ibram Kendi on anti-racism, how to be an anti-racist, stamped from the beginning, these resources that we should be engaging in the course of this year for our own learning and our study. I find it important that we advance a conversation that includes racism, systemic and structural, that we honor, and I know this is a controversial point, but I agree with Kendi on this point, that it's more important that we deal with anti-racist, that we deal with racist ideas and racist policies than talking about racist people, because our historical definitions of racist people are outmoded, right? If you're advancing a racist idea through racist policies, then that is racist, right? That's number one. Number two, and I think it's important for us to note that racism has impacts on all of us, right? Has impacts, I go with King on this point, that it has impacts on those who hold racist ideas in their heart. It diminishes their humanity. It impacts brown people disproportionately, but also there is a matter of anti-Black racism that suggests that it impacts Black people in a manner that is different and perhaps even in some ways deeper, without engaging in oppression in the Olympics, in a way that is deeper than others. Because what we have seen is generation after generation, different ethnic groups from other countries have been grafted into the remuneration of whiteness, the capacity to be compensated for being white, and yet Black people have not. And we see anti-Black racism play out in America. We see it play out contemporary in my lifestyle in South Africa, and it plays out all over the globe. But I think there is a uniqueness to how we understand anti-Blackness and as a subcategory of racism playing out in America. And I think we've got to center that Black people have a unique posture, position, and experience negative impacts in ways that some others don't, because of the wider concept of white supremacy.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Wilson. Stan in the comments said that $120 million was defunded from public schools, and that carceral systems never get defunded, but our kids constantly get defunded. And then Sarah added that in KCMO, $30 million of the school district's funding gets diverted and sent to developers instead. We've got to count our kids means a lot. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I appreciate the work. I mean, this is where we talk about the reimagination of child well-being. This is where we talk about the need to transform systems. One of the reasons why we're able to do that is because of the political alliances that many of these unions have, particularly police unions have. And we got to get, these kind of coalitions, we got to get much more thoughtful and strategic about our broad definitions of labor. Because we find ourselves contending with police unions that have a unique amount of power and that protect themselves and they use narratives around justice in order to, they flatten out the concept of justice to mean law and order. And we've got to get stronger in our narratives there, but we also have to reimagine ways that we fund some of these systems. Because we recognize that the most significant disparity in funding related to public education has to do with the fact that it's funded based on property taxes. So the kids that need the most resources also find themselves in cities and urban areas that have lower property tax revenue. And so those kids are, from the beginning, they get less support and less resource.
Thank you. And then Esther on the Zoom chat asked, this is a great loaded question, how do we get past the talking and come up with a strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, quite frankly, I mean, I appreciate the question, and I believe that the organizations in this coalition are living out both strategies and tactics. I'm grateful that they are, so I think everybody needs to be, everyone needs a political home. I say this to people a lot. I say you need an organization that is bigger than you, that is working to advance an agenda that's bigger than you. And so you need a political expression at home to do that. I don't think parties are necessarily the places for political homes. I think grassroots organizations are, and they have the ability to push parties. So I encourage people to get connected to the organization of their choice, to work with a body of people who they identify with, whether that's, you identify with mamas, big mamas, and grandmamas who are taking care of their grandkids, then organize the mamas, big mamas, and grandmamas who are taking care of their grandkids, and use that moral voice to advance something. If you identify as a person of faith, then you need to be working with people like Missouri Faith Voices and others, and More Squared and others who are a part of this coalition and call to advance an agenda. So I think the agenda is there. We just got to get out of our individualized selves and silos, get into our organizational collectives in order to advance a broad movement for justice.
Thank you. And then I actually have a question here from JMO. JMO would like to know what lessons can be learned from the passing of Prop R in St. Louis and Amendment 2. JMO says, when politicians don't get the job done, are there ways we can take the power into our own hands?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was alluding to this a little bit. I don't think we have to just go to this cycle. I mean, what we talk about with Proposition R, which for those who are in other parts of the state, this was an effort by child advocates and those who are focused on early childhood education to put the opportunity for a property tax on the ballot to invest additional resources and programs for early childhood services in the city of St. Louis. It was successful. So an additional, I think approximately 2.2. I see somebody from We Power in the chat. They may correct me on this. I think it's about 2.3 million a year that'll be invested in early childhood programs. So yeah, we can do those things. That's built on models we've seen in other places like the city of San Antonio, where they did the same. There, it was much more built on buildings and infrastructure for early child education. But I will say this, these are all workarounds. The reality is these investments should be happening at a state level. So we're working at metropolitan levels and we're increasing taxes on metropolitan areas. And I'm glad we did it as a property tax and not as a sales tax and make sure it's not as regressive. I'm totally on board with the way that this was done. And I recognize that we have come to metropolitan levels because the states have not functioned appropriately. Missouri consistently finds itself in the lower 3 to 5 states of the 50 in investment in early child education. So we're trying to figure out solutions in Kansas City and in Missouri, and Kansas City and St. Louis, for making up for what we've not been able. We've not accumulated the power and political accountability to make our state legislators and our governors do. And so what we need is much more close bonds across the networks of this call and others to make sure that we are organizing to press those who have deeper purse strings, and deeper pockets to get it done at the state level.
Then we have ML Smith on Zoom. They say, Dr. Wilson, I've been speaking about childism for a while. Since connecting to Dr. Stacy Patton, who has done much work on behalf of children, I'd like to ask, how do we get more Black parents to decolonize their parenting? How do we get them to understand that physical assault, corporal punishment is a continuation of the massive slave relationship? When will we stop perpetuating oppression and subjugation upon the bodies of Black babies?
With love, I say, when we start speaking plain language to one another. One of our trustees at Deaconess Foundation, who is a remarkable organizer, she's the director of advocacy for the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis. Her name is Carissa Anderson. She says, use regular words. She didn't say regular, she said regular. We got to use regular words, which means we got to speak to people in the languages that they understand. And I appreciate the decolonizing approaches and language, but the reality is we got to speak more plainly. We got to stop having white folks. We got to stop having Black folks treat our kids like white folk have treated us. Okay, so I mean that's what we're talking about. The masses of Black people wouldn't even understand that question, right? So let's just talk about the fact that our children don't get a voice. Let's talk about the fact that we treat adults better than children, rather than talking about childism. Let's talk about the fact that we got to raise our kids with love, and love doesn't mean beating them in the ways that people try to beat us down when we go to work. And so until we can get up, we've gotten, and I'm gonna critique our coalitions a little bit. We have gotten super educated and we impress one another with words so much that we actually can't talk to regular folks. And it's the same way with our strategy. So I'm gonna take this to another level and say, we write, I'm talking about pastors, right? So we write theological treatises for the academy and the seminary, and we don't preach that stuff, right? Because we can't figure out how to preach it to everyday people who are wrestling with this, with the everyday reality. So I think we got to do that. We got to do that with our activism too. And so I think that's a critical piece. And yes, Kathy, there should be a children's rights amendment, but we could start by basic stuff like, America is the only country in the civilized or developed world that didn't sign on to the UN Declaration of Children's Rights. Like, how about that? There's some really basic things that we can do that have already been done. But more than anything else, we as people who are committed to the core of this movement, we got to talk to regular folks. We got to get out into neighborhoods. We got to mask up. We lost. We don't count our kids in this state because we were so smart that we thought that we could text our way and phone call our way into mobilizing a vote. So there were essentially only 2 organizations working across the state doing real canvassing and knocking on doors. If one more organization had knocked the right doors, we would have kept clean Missouri. So that's one piece of broader issues. I won't preach anymore, but we got to talk to one another. We got to talk to the people who count, and they're not the people with the PhDs.
And one of our Zoomers is asking, parenting is work, but it is not honored as such in public policy. What campaigns will you lead at the Children's Defense Fund that will lead to policies that respect parents and their children?
Yeah, one of the things that I really hope to do at the Children's Defense Fund is rooted in the history of Missouri. 1993, as a part of the Black Community Crusade for Children in Kansas City, the first freedom schools across the country, supported by the Kauffman Foundation at the time, were planted in churches, in a network of churches in Kansas City. Critical elements of that program have to do with parent engagement, student organizing. Students, college students are actually the people who implement the program to do literacy for children St. Louis became one of the largest locations, at one point as many as 12 Freedom School sites in St. Louis. We in Deaconess Foundation over the last 5 years have also worked to redevelop and reconstitute a network. And now we've got about 5 Freedom School sites, and actually 6 total in St. Louis. One of the reasons why I mention that is because Freedom Schools give us an opportunity while doing literacy education for young people K through 12 to also organize students who are a part of this program. They learn in our Ella Baker Policy Institute about the civil rights movement, about organizing strategies. We tend to plant them in many cases in churches, which gives us a faith-based organizing opportunity. And then we have parent engagement, which we in St. Louis have made parent organizing. So we partner with people like Metropolitan Congregations United, Community Organizing and Family Issues in Action St. Louis to educate parents and to glean from parents what should be the policy issues. So what I want to say is what I look forward to doing is leveraging the Freedom Schools infrastructure, which is working in 97 cities throughout the United States of America in partnership with the Children's Defense Fund to do student, family, and faith-based organizing in order to lift an agenda that comes from the ground. And this is another critical piece for us, right? I don't think there should be policy without proximity. So listening to parents will be the factor that drives a parent level policy that is consistent with their kitchen table issues.
And then I hope I'm pronouncing their name right. Khadijah on Facebook states, Chokwe Lumumba frequently stated, in order to lead the people, you have to first love the people. Can you respond to the impact on children when organizations are leading more for their purposes than for the people they purportedly serve?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that we've sought to meet out over the last few years at Deaconess Foundation on our own journey to be an anti-racist institution and to integrate racial equity commitments in all of our practices. We've learned about a concept and we've begun to work in a concept called relational capacity. For those who do work with children, you understand this as that connection between a parent or a teacher and a student that allows the student to learn. If the student feels comfortable and connected, then they release the barriers and they're able to learn. But what we found is that when we talk about organizational effectiveness, the same thing actually works its way out for that. So organizations that look like or reflect the communities they say they serve are actually more effective in getting the work done. And so we've been intentional to say that if you want to demonstrate to Deaconess the capacity to carry out work for racial justice and for child well-being, then your organization should reflect that. So we ask, what are the racial demographics of your board? What are the racial demographics of your staff? Because those racial demographics tell us more about whether the community trusts you or not. Organizationally, it's not just about racial demographics, it's also about feedback and communication loops and channels. Do you have the capacity to speak to your community? And does your community have, or those whom you say you serve, do they have the capacity to speak back to you? Do they have voice in your governance? When we start talking about mobilization and connectedness, are you only serving people or are you also registering them as voters? It's not a political activity, anyone could do that. Because what we know is if you register voters, when you come to Jefferson City, the people who are doing legislation in Jefferson City are going to listen more to you than they are to the people who only serve them. So it's helpful for service-related organizations to be able to speak to say, yes, we have this many clients each year. We serve 50,000 clients and we registered 35,000 of them to vote. And we have regular communications with them, and this many of them are on our email list, and this many are actually opening our emails. These are all indicators of your relational capacity within the communities that you say you serve.
And what would you suggest as a first step for nonprofits who are looking to expand their racial equity work and certainly doing that internal reflection without tokenizing people of color or voices of color?
Yeah, I'd say first, you want to get a level set. So ask yourself the questions and disaggregate the data within your organization. So if you've got data, you know who you serve. Ask the questions of what the demographics of those people are. What are the demographics of your staff? What are the demographics of your of your leadership and your board. I think that's first and foremost, know where you are. Second, spend some time, and this is just basic stuff, ask people what they think of you. You can do that in a quantitative way, doing a survey, or you can do it in a qualitative way. I advise this for leadership, that this is work that the executive director should be doing, spending time with stakeholders, asking people what they think of your organization and community, and doing it with people that are either they trust you enough to tell you the truth, or they have nothing to gain from you, so they'll tell you the truth. I think those are good places to begin. And then engaging outside support. I think, and this can happen in a couple ways. If you don't have budget, book clubs are helpful. To just, in our organization at Deaconess Foundation, we regularly read and did devotions that were connected to our principles, to our values, including racial equity. And so we as staff just read stuff together and interpreted to one another. And then at a next level, I would definitely encourage getting some support and consultation for this, so that your staff are not, your Black and brown staff are not called on to educate your white staff. Because quite frankly, they're doing that already. Y'all just don't know it. So they have to navigate that anyway. So external support to facilitate those conversations is really helpful.
And what about organizations that would respond? We're, struggling so hard just to get through COVID-19 right now. We don't have time to focus on racial equity.
You ain't got nothing but time. So, quite frankly, one of the things that I say, and I borrowed this from Big Brother Michael McAfee at PolicyLink, the president of PolicyLink, especially, and I've adapted it for the work of child well-being. If you believe that you are serving or advocating for children in 2020, when the majority of America's children are non-white, and you're not doing cultural competency or racial equity work, what you're doing is engaging in work avoidance. If you say you serve children and you're not paying attention to racial equity in this moment in American history, you're lying to yourself and you're not fulfilling your mission. So this is not an add-on. This is about effectiveness.
And then one of our Zoomers said, the Trump administration issued an executive order to silence the speaking of the word structural racism in federal trainings and professional development. What would you like to see a Biden-Harris administration do to build a racial equity lens among government workers?
And quite frankly, it's already building. So there'll be a series of executive orders that'll go to repeal, including to repeal exactly that action. So I look forward to that. There's more work to do in education. What I'd really like to see is just rebuilding of the structures for accountability and robust implementation. So accountability for, rebuilding and construction of accountability in the Department of Justice around policing, the same kinds of levels of accountability in different areas of government that were being built, which is why he had to respond to it. One of the things I always think about, one of the things I was taught at Eden Seminary is about stop sign theology. When you read the Bible and it says that people shouldn't do something, you should read beyond it and recognize that people were doing it. That's the only reason to say that people shouldn't do it. So I'm gratified that that 46-1 had to do that, because that means that people in government were already building some of the infrastructure necessary, that he had to put a stop sign there.
And then I see a follow-up comment from Alicia saying, if people can make the time to wait for 3 hours in line to see Tim McGraw, then they can fight injustice across sectors. No excuses.
Can't say amen, say ouch.
Ouch. And then Wes on Zoom would like to know if work is being done to ensure LGBTQ plus groups and people have a seat at the table and you're planning an outreach. Today is the Transgender Day of Remembrance, a day focused on those we lost. But as we move forward, today is a day to call out for inclusion and lifting up trans people, especially Black and brown community leaders.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I totally agree with that. So there's some folks who are going to be upset with me for missing that. So thank you for the opportunity to address it. So clearly LGBTQIA and trans folk have to be a part of the conversation and have to be critical in how we understand our work for justice and equity. We have to be building. I'm grateful for the work that the ACLU of Missouri has done around building trans demands and campaigns around that throughout the state. I'm glad that they're one of Deaconess Foundation's most critical partners through our Anchor Institutions program. and that they have built some of that infrastructure for us. So I commend people to them for some of the learning. That's really, I tell people when you do work, I wrote a piece earlier this week, when we do work for racial justice, or we do work that is bigger than us for child well-being, there's always unfinished business. I think we built some good structure at Deaconess Foundation around racial equity. One of the things that our board chair has been guiding us in, and that he's been helpful in pushing me on, is ways in which we should be more mindful of intersectionality in that work. We name it, but our journey is such that we hadn't gotten as sharp as we need to be in order to advance the new world vision that we desire. So I think it's a work for all of us. I'm glad that ACLU of Missouri and others are teaching us more about that work, and I'm glad that Deaconess's board has that kind of leader to help to advance us in it. I'll claim that while I've seen it at some of the convenings and learnings with and trainings with the Children's Defense Fund, or executive directors for freedom schools and the like, I've not seen it in the organizational strategy in the ways that I think is going to be helpful. So that's one of the things that I'll need to do in my leadership there.
And then Esther on Zoom would like to know if you believe there needs to be something in place to deal with the residual effects of slavery and the pandemic of crack cocaine, and then also the legacy of trauma. Esther is asking these questions because as an 82-year-old Black woman, she knows how we were targeted even by the government, and that drugs were brought into our communities to infect and destroy us as a people.
Yeah, I totally believe in healing justice. And I think, when we start talking about healing justice, healing approaches, whether we're talking about somatics, I think there's work that needs to be done structurally. And I think some of that is happening systemically. There's education around these things that have to happen for some communities, and there's support and work to heal that needs to happen in others. I'm really excited about the work we were able to do earlier this year in St. Louis to build to launch. We've really been working on building it for a few years, the St. Louis Regional Racial Healing Fund. That is funding efforts, and community members are making decisions around efforts that will advance healing and justice on both the impacts, the consequences, and the conditions of that trauma, but also to react to shifting and healing the systems that create that trauma. And so I think philanthropy has a role to play to making sure there are resources for that. But I also think communities speak most clearly into what they need. So I think, I talk about reconciliation a lot. I say that it needs to be both concrete and contextual. So these are places where the community needs to determine what modalities of healing it needs. And so I'm glad that fund is helping to do that. I think we need that kind of structural support at even deeper levels, at the state level and nationally.
And then sadly, we've just got time for one last question. This is from Sheila on Zoom asking, many people of color are exhausted having to educate and realize it contributes to more racial trauma for themselves. How do we move forward while protecting ourselves?
Yeah, I want to answer this. I'm gonna repeat it for me because I want to connect it to something I saw in the chat.
Many people of color are exhausted having to educate and realize it contributes to more racial trauma for themselves. How do we move forward while protecting ourselves?
So that's very similar to a question that Kira Anderson asked in the Zoom chat that I was kind of picking up the top of, and it speaks to advice for Black leaders within white power structures. So first and foremost, I want to say, we've got to learn about the marks of white dominant culture, and we should fight it because it is anti-American, right? Now, when I say American, I mean something different. I mean, not the idea of who we say we are that is based on the concept of hierarchies of human value and white supremacy. I'm talking about the America that is, not the figment of anybody's imagination. I'm talking about work and life where people of color are people of the global majority. I'm talking about the rising demographics of America that call for us to reconsider a multiracial democracy and the beloved community. So I say first and foremost, part of the work that we've got to do is to name and to frame. Our education can't be about little things. We're going to end up doing this education work. We've got to educate people on white dominant culture and its structures. And so that has to be our curriculum, learning and framing that first. Second, We've got to, and not getting into any intramural battles about that. Second, we indeed do have to protect ourselves, not just by naming it, but also by transitioning when settings are not valuable and not healthy for our thriving. That nobody deserves your work, your fealty, or your obeisance. Nobody owns your humanity, and no mission is worth you sacrificing your whole self, your whole God-given, God-created self. And so, if those structures are taking life from you, then you leave them. And I'm gratified that I've seen Black leaders do that. I'm also saying, especially in the social sector, that we must know that there is a racial leadership gap in the social sector, nonprofit, government, philanthropic, that has everything to do with white supremacy, the implicit bias of boards of directors who choose executive directors, and lack of access to financial capital because we have funders and we have individual donors and families who only want to hear from white people. And so there are progressive, liberal, moderate white people who are doing as much damage to Black people and people of color in the social sector as there are conservatives outside of it who don't fund our work. So we've got to own that work. And I want to tell Black people, I want to tell leaders of color, keep telling the truth, own your humanity. And if they want to affirm you, they don't deserve you. Nobody can pay you enough to be demeaned and/or oppressed. Nobody can pay you enough to try to keep acting like you fit into their structures. Last thing I'll say, I wasn't the leader I needed to be at Deaconess Foundation until I realized that I could appreciate the straight, white, male, clergy person in his 60s who came before me without having to prove to people that I could do things the way he did them. And so once I started doing stuff the way I needed to do it, our mission took off. We served people in the way that God called for us in this moment. So the last piece of advice I've got is, you don't have to fit into white dominant culture. You be you. God made your beautiful Black self for this beautiful multiracial time. So serve the mission by being who God made you to be.
That resonates with me deeply. I have one last little question. Do you have recommendations for how white people can be more respectful and supportive to our Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are leaders when they so often benefit from their labor without understanding them?
You know, last night I watched Sports Center, and there's this Sports Center that comes on at night. I forget this guy's name. But he did an interview with Matthew McConaughey. Matthew McConaughey has a new book out. I haven't read it, so I can't recommend it. But I think about that movie he was in some time ago. It was a legal kind of thriller that he was in, and it was all about a legal case in the South where someone abused and may have killed, if I remember correctly, a little Black girl. It was an all-white jury. It was a little white girl who was harmed, a white jury. A Time to Kill. Thank you, Jill Merriweather in the chat for helping me out. Time to Kill. And he asked the jury to think about all that happened to this little girl, little Black girl. Think about all that happened to this Black girl, and then think about how they would have understood that if that was their daughter, because it was her father who was on trial. And he asked this all-white jury to think about them. Close your eyes. Yeah, thank you, Pastor Jackson. It's close your eyes, imagine her, and think about the damage that these men did to her, and think about that. Because he was trying to get them to understand the anger of her father who acted out on these men. And he finally had to get to the point, once they understood and could feel the pain of having their very child impacted, they couldn't get to making the decision they needed until he said to them, now imagine she's white. How to get white people to treat Black people respectfully? I hate to say it, but we still at that point in America. Just imagine they white. Black people indigenous people don't need a whole lot of extra stuff. Treat them like humans. Treat them to the level of the humanity that you treat all of your white colleagues. That is the thing that will interrupt and subvert the elements of white supremacy and the hierarchy of human value that is embedded in you because it is in the air you breathe. It is in the water you drink. It's tied up to the same question from before, where people were like, how do we get to decolonize Black parenting? Well, it has to do with the fact that we have dehumanized Blackness. So there are no tricks to treating BIPOC people. I don't really like that term. There are no tricks to treating Black, Indigenous, and people of color like humans. Yeah, if you need a trick, imagine they're white. And wrestle with why you needed that trick.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Wilson. And that ends our question and answer period. And we're so very thankful to have heard you today. Best wishes for your new position at the Children's Defense Fund. And we know that your future success will undoubtedly enrich all of our lives.
Thank you.
And so now is the time, friends of justice, for those important calls to action that I mentioned earlier. Our technical consultants, Missouri Political Consulting, have woven together messages from our co-sponsors so that each of us can find an effort to join that will make an important difference. We ask you to listen carefully. Excuse me. We ask you to listen carefully and to consider where your own interests and desires lie. If we each do our part, racial justice and equity can be achieved.
Slide 1. I'm Rico Bush, Communications Director for Empower Missouri. Our organization has been a faithful voice for social justice since 1901, standing against structural racism and securing important public policy victories like the establishment of the Missouri Human Rights Commission, the Public Defenders Commission, and the Housing Trust Fund. Slide 2. For our state to thrive, we need evidence-based public policy that is free of bias and structural oppression, promoting justice for all. We continue our work for racial equity now and into 2021 through the work of our 4 coalitions that we staff. Those coalitions are the Affordable Housing Coalition, the Food Security Coalition, the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition, and the Smart Sentencing Coalition. Here are the priorities of each and how you can engage in their vital campaigns. Slide 3. Our Affordable Housing Coalition knows that Missouri has an affordable housing crisis. Black and brown communities are disproportionately harmed due to the intentional legacy of racist housing policies across our country. We begin with the question, what will it take for everyone in Missouri to have access to safe housing, which is truly affordable to them? We can increase the supply of affordable housing by reforming the low-income housing tax credit program. In 2019 and 2020, we defeated harmful legislation that would have hurt tenants during eviction procedures, and we will be prepared to guard against this again in 2021. No one should be discriminated against in housing due to the source of their income, like the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, or SSI for people with disabilities, and the Tax Increment Finance Program has been abused, advantaging wealthy communities and harming those historically disadvantaged. We meet the second Monday of every month at 2 p.m., including Monday, December 14th. Join us to build power to make change. Slide 4. The Food Security Coalition. During the pandemic, Feeding America projects that food insecurity in Missouri will rise from 12% to 16.4%. Black and Latinx families have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and income losses in the recession. We must expand and simplify access to the safety net. A 15% increase in SNAP will reduce hunger and stimulate local economies during the pandemic. We defeated work hour documentation bills that would have cut tens of thousands of families off of SNAP during the past 3 legislative sessions, and we will defend against any new attacks. We can also promote affirmative food justice solutions like vouchers for fresh produce at local farmers markets. Join us on Friday, December 4th at 9 a.m. to build power to make change. Slide 5. The Missouri HIV Justice Coalition. Missouri is one of more than 30 states that still criminalize HIV status through a variety of HIV-specific criminal codes. It is time to end the stigma and change these laws. Let's modernize Missouri's outdated and medically inaccurate HIV-specific policies, including the elimination of sentence enhancements for people living with HIV. Join us on Friday, December 11th at 1 p.m. to build power to make change. Slide 6. The Smart Sentencing Coalition. Structural racism has deeply impacted criminal justice in Missouri as it has in other states. Black and Latinx communities have higher rates of incarceration and of children being certified to stand trial and be sentenced as adults. This must end. We must improve the employability of persons who were formerly incarcerated by removing barriers in state law. We should adopt smart sentencing instead of repeating past tough on crime failures, assessing risks, and enact elder parole and community alternatives to incarceration. Children's right to counsel must be assured, and no child should be certified to stand trial or be sentenced as an adult. We must reform law enforcement, demanding accountability of agencies that use excessive force or police in racially biased manners. Join us on Friday, December 18th at 11 a.m. to build power to make change. Slide 7. You can find a wealth of resources, events, and the latest about the General Assembly's actions on our website at www.empowermissouri.org.
There couldn't be a more important time to center racial equity as we plan what's next for justice. The Clark Fox Family Foundation uses research, community education, program development, and collaboration to forward leadership, entrepreneurship, and justice in the areas of race, education, immigration, and public health. We collaborate primarily in the St. Louis region, though we engage with partners statewide to influence a more effective and humane criminal justice system. And we work with partners throughout the country on how ecosystem mapping, data usage, and digital equity can inform decisions and connect the community. In addition to our own projects, like our Blueprint 4 platforms that connect students to out-of-school learning, scholarships, and career credentialing programs, we are eager to amplify the work of local leaders. For example, this summer, we were pleased to help add a new mapping tool to a dynamic website that connects consumers to St. Louis area Black-owned businesses. In fact, if you have holiday shopping needs, we encourage you to visit fortheculturestl.com to check out their annual holiday catalog. At the Clark Fox Family Foundation, we're heartened to see so many advocates at today's summit, and we encourage you to be in touch via social media or our website, clarkfoxstl.com. We are eager to learn about innovative visions for moving forward and how we might be a meaningful partner to help dismantle barriers, to mentor great ideas, and to work together to build a just, healthy, and thriving region, state, and country.
Deaconess Foundation is a grant-making organization building power for child well-being through philanthropy, advocacy, and organizing for racial equity and public policy change. A ministry of the United Church of Christ, Deaconess has invested more than $85 million to improve the health of the St. Louis community since 1998. The Foundation's advocacy and grant-making footprint includes St. Louis City, St. Louis, Jefferson, St. Charles, and Franklin counties in Missouri, and Madison, St. Clair, and Monroe counties in Illinois. Our understanding of racial equity is informed by our partners in mission, colleagues in philanthropy, and community of service. This year, in 2020, Deaconess made an institutional commitment to the wider movement for racial justice. We are reaching beyond our local funding focus and our support for management activity to breathe life into our vocation as an institutional advocate for racial justice. We invite you to join us. Please visit Movement for Black Lives at m4bl.org to learn about the power building work and policy commitments of the Movement for Black Lives and make a financial contribution. We invite board members of philanthropies in St. Louis, the state of Missouri, and nationwide to begin a relationship with ADVI, a philanthropic initiative for Black communities, by first reading and responding to the philanthropic call to action, then signing up for institutional membership, and lastly, underwriting individual memberships for the professional development of your staff, especially Black staff. And finally, we invite the faith community to join us in affirming and acting on the Samuel DeWitt Proctor's Conference's calls to the church for racial justice. Join us in our journey to racial equity.
The Missouri Budget Project is excited to sponsor and participate in today's Racial Equity Summit. MVP analyzes state budget, tax, health, and economic issues, and engages Missourians in advocacy through outreach, coalitions, and communications. Our mission is to improve the quality of life for all Missourians. But to truly serve all people, we must identify racial inequities so that we work for policy solutions that actually benefit everyone. Our state budget and tax policies have broad implications for our communities disadvantaged by structural racism. We hope that you will join us to advance equity by signing up for our email list and working with us to create a state earned income tax credit. Thank you for all you do.
The Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness is the lead agency for the Jackson County, Missouri and Wyandotte County HUD Continuum of Care. The topic of racial equity is a particularly important one in these times, and it is central to the work we do every day around housing and homelessness. We are a proud sponsor of Empower Missouri and its work to ensure all Missourians have equitable access to the basic necessities of life, particularly safe, decent, affordable housing, and are delighted that they are leading the charge by inviting all of you to engage in this difficult but necessary and timely discussion.
Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice seeks to create a world that values equity and justice for all. We invite you to join us in that work. Our Racial Justice Committee focuses on criminal justice reform and promoting affordable housing. We continue to promote understanding that gun violence is a public health issue through our Lock It for Love initiative, providing free gun locks with gun safety tips in high-risk communities. Our next education program, Stop the Bullets, Community Efforts to Prevent Gun Violence, is December 10th. Register on our website. While you're there, check out our education programs, our racial justice book club and movie nights, and ways that you can be involved to make a difference. Together, we can create a more just and equitable world.
The Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis is proud to be a co-sponsor of today's summit and to partner with Empower Missouri's Smart Sentencing Coalition. JCRC is focused on educating the Jewish community about systemic racism and the need for reforms in many areas. We are working in coalition with social justice advocates across the state on our priority issues. Our programs are open to all, and we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters to learn more about upcoming programs.
On behalf of everyone at Operation Food Search, thank you for your interest and attention today. If you'd like to learn more about our work and help spread the word, there are a few things you can do. Share our Find Food map, which is available on our website at operationfoodsearch.org, or by texting a zip code to 785-503-3310. The map or text line will provide several nearby locations for food assistance. We'd also love you to join us in our policy and advocacy efforts. The best way to stay informed is to subscribe to our OFS Food Advocate newsletter by emailing advocacy@operationfoodsearch.org. You can also follow these efforts on Twitter at OFS Food Advocate. And of course, engaging with us on social media is always appreciated and helps amplify our work and our mission. You'll find us at Op Food Search. We look forward to hearing from you.
Missouri Kids First is a proud gold sponsor of the 2020 Racial Equity Summit. We are the state network of child advocacy centers in the seat of Prevent Child Abuse, Missouri. At Missouri Kids First, our mission is to empower adults to protect children from abuse by providing leadership, training, technical assistance, and legislative and policy advocacy. All of our work helps to further our vision of a consistent statewide response to child abuse and neglect that provides all children with equitable access to the necessary health and social services to allow them to thrive. We want to thank our friends at Empower Missouri for hosting today's summit. We know that our goals of justice and healing for all children cannot be achieved without recognizing and dismantling the systems of bias that provide privilege to some and are harmful and unjust to others. Ambiguity toward racism and social injustice cannot be accepted. Please visit www.missourikidsfirst.org to learn more about our work. We also invite you to check out our Essential for Kids campaign, a special campaign we launched this year during the COVID-19 pandemic. Check out our website to learn more.
The Salvation Army Midland Division serves without discrimination in Missouri and Southern Illinois. Our programs include City Mission Collective, which equips persons affiliated with the Salvation Army to fully pursue God's mission of reconciliation for all creation. In this way, City Mission Collective will continue to educate these affiliates about the realities of racism and empower them to actively pursue justice by resourcing them with training tools, including application of the Salvation Army's racial equity lens. We also offer the Pathway to Health program at our Ferguson Community Empowerment Center. Pathway to Health builds health equity by reducing the health disparities between African Americans and others in St. Louis County. Learn more about our racial equity work at our website, salarmymidland.org, and join us for our virtual Tree of Lights kickoff November 20th at 4:30 p.m. Help us rescue Christmas for the most vulnerable in our community. The Salvation Army Midland Division serves without discrimination.
At Places for People, we are dedicated to the cause of race equity. One of the most defining ways that Places for People has shown this is recruiting and hiring me as a diversity and inclusion officer, even in the middle of a pandemic. Through this opportunity, I've been able to start several initiatives aimed at creating a more inclusive environment for staff and persons served. The initiatives include a once quarterly listening session to discuss inequity and semi-monthly small group discussions on relevant topics in inequity.
We came to this work to help make the world a better place. You did too. In 2020, the executive office is now our living room, and our conference rooms are our kitchens. The digital world has enabled us to keep ourselves and our families safe. Across town or across cultures, BuzzBold unites nonprofit fundraising, programs, and people so you can make the right decisions, deepen and explain your impact, giving your donors a reason to do more. BuzzBold, amplifying nonprofit cultures and strengths through digital innovation since 2011. We came to this work to help make the world a better place.
Missouri Jobs with Justice is an organization by and for working people of all races and identities. We believe in solidarity. That means showing up for each other, no matter what zip code you live in, where you're from, who you love, or what race you are. Our organization is a place for people who want to stop the wealthy few from mistreating and dividing us, and start getting the dignity we deserve. We will continue to stand and fight together for an economy and democracy that works for all of us, no exceptions. Be it protecting the initiative petition process, fighting for living wages and time with our families, standing shoulder to shoulder against coercive bosses, fighting for healthcare for all. We'll be there. We win when we come together, and we all do better when we all do better. Anyone re-entering the community after prison faces many roadblocks to success. But for those dealing with the additional challenges of mental illness or prior trauma, substance abuse, and a history of incarceration, the journey is even more complex. Unfortunately, such people have often had nowhere to turn for help. Journey to New Life was created to be that place. At Journey to New Life and Journey House, former offenders who are re-entering the community get so much more than just a place to sleep at night or help with basic human needs. Because it's built on a restorative justice approach focused on healing, hope, and most importantly, an opportunity to begin again, it offers them the power to change. Journey to New Life. We maximize quality of life for men and women returning to the community from prison or other involvement with the justice system. Learn more at journeytonewlife.org.
Hi, my name is Jim Wallace. I'm Director of Business Development for Chestnut Health Systems. Chestnut Health Systems is a behavioral health agency providing substance use, mental health, and primary care services in the Metro St. Louis area, Madison and St. Clair County, Illinois, as well as our offices in Jefferson County, Missouri. Please contact me if you have an interest in partnering or collaborating on any specific type of issue.
As a physician, I had a 60-year-old grandmother ask me how long she could live without taking her blood pressure pills. She's Black, she works full-time, and she wants to live despite having no insurance. Medicare for All won't solve our plague of racism, but it would mean that Black Americans would no longer have so many years stolen from their lives. We know how to fix this. Learn more and join us at showmemedicareforall.org.
Gateway Housing First is a mission-driven developer, owner, and operator of specialized permanent supported housing communities. We also provide housing placement services, rental assistance, and housing stability case management to households needing permanent supportive housing. Guided by the values and outcomes achieved by Housing First and harm reduction programs, our immediate focus is on increasing housing solutions for the most vulnerable in our region, typically demonstrated by prolonged or repeated episodes of homelessness, very little or no income, and more than one disability and/or serious health condition. We eliminate housing readiness barriers to ensure equal access to available housing solutions. More Squared is the Metro Organization for Racial and Educational Equity. We are a faith-based organization in Kansas City focused on racial equity. We undertake campaigns addressing criminal justice, education, workforce, and immigration. We welcome your participation. Learn more or become a member at www.more2.org/issues.
I am Nimrod Chappell Jr., President of the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP. The Missouri State Conference issued the first ever travel advisory telling people that if you come into Missouri, your civil rights might not be respected and you could lose your life, such as Tory Sanders, in a case where no one was ever prosecuted, even though he died at the hands of law enforcement in a Mississippi County jail. We ask that you continue your fight for justice and equality.
Missouri Coalition for the Environment, or MCE, is excited to be a co-sponsor of the Racial Equity Summit. Our mission is to educate, organize, and advocate in defense of Missouri's people and their environment. Our work includes policy advocacy on clean water, clean air, open space, and healthy, sustainable food systems. Our action we encourage you to join us in today is our Factory Farm, or CAFO, advocacy network to combat the proliferation of factory farms in our state.
Kids with Missouri is a coalition dedicated to improving child well-being. Our vision is that all kids have the chance to grow up happy, healthy, and successful. We work to advance equity-centered policies and systems changes that support children and families. We also aim to create an inclusive table of stakeholders that represents the diversity of our state. Sign up for our emails at kidswinmissouri.org to get updates on policy issues impacting children and families, and to join our weekly calls on Fridays during the state legislative session.
As a statewide, unapologetically Black-led organization, Missouri Faith Voices continue to work toward racial equity, defend democracy, and expanded the electorate in 2020. We need you in 2021 to bend the arc toward justice in Springfield, Columbia, Jefferson City, St. Louis, and Kansas City as we ensure Medicaid expansion is implemented and fight to expand voter rights in 2022. Come help us bend the arc.
For the past 4 years, Myers-Okeson Political Consulting has been at the forefront of progressive progress for candidates, campaigns, and organizations who share our values. We know that Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, love is love, and a living wage is vital to uplifting our region. Stay in touch with us at mopoliticalconsulting.com.
Hello, I'm back, and I'm so excited about the opportunities to step into valuable campaigns that have been shared today. Again, we thank you for joining this online Racial Equity Summit and especially thank our co-sponsors. In closing, I will hand off the microphone to Jeanette Mott Oxford, Director of Policy and Organizing for Empower Missouri, better known as JMO. JMO will tell participants how to receive continuing education hour certificates for attending today, and also how to further contribute to Empower Missouri's financial needs. It was good to be with you today, and handing it off to you, JMO.
Thank you, Markea. And thank you, Nicole, for the wonderful welcome today, and all of our board members for your hard work. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Wilson, for your inspiring words and your courageous call to action for all of us. We do invite everyone to stay engaged. As Dr. Wilson said, we have to worry about not just COVID-19, but COVID-16-19, and that structural racism has harmed our country so much. And we see how the disproportionate number of people harmed in this pandemic are Black and Brown, other communities of color. So it's really important that we be active in the Affordable Housing Coalition, the Food Security Coalition, the HIV Justice Coalition, and the Smart Sentencing Coalition. You can find lots of information about how to do that on our website. And let's not forget that it does take money for us to have staff, for us to have resources for you through our website, through our social media, through things like stipends that we provide to people that speak for our community forums. Sometimes folks who aren't employed by an agency but are wonderful community voices and aren't paid by somebody to do some work for us. So we like to provide them a stipend. So please help us by donating online at www.empowermissouri.org. In order to get your continuing education credits, I've put a prompt down in the chat box, and there's a slide there that I think the folks at Myers-Okeson Political Consulting may be able to put that slide up that tells you that what you need to do is to email Christine Woody at christine@empowermissouri.org and give her your name, your mailing address, your email address, and the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. She will send you a continuing education hours certificate as a PDF by email, and you will have had to complete the survey as evidence that you attended the summit today. so that you get your continuing education hours. For those who've asked, will this information be available later? Yes, shortly after this summit ends online, you'll get an email that gives you a link to a recording, and we'll also see what we can do about providing perhaps a slideshow as well that you could download on our website for the resources that were offered by our co-sponsors. It'll, at least for sure, will be there as a recording that you can watch online. And we'd like to ask everybody to go ahead and mark your calendars now for noon on Friday, December 18th. That's when we have our next community forum. We used to meet in person in Kansas City and in St. Louis and inform you about how to be a strong public policy advocate on a number of issues. We can't do that safely right now, so we're doing that online. And you can join us at noon on December 18th for a preview of the legislative session and some of the main issues that we think that everybody should be engaged in. So be sure to support our work. And Markea, do you have any last words for people as we're going away?
You know, I'd just like to say thank you. It's, you know, really, I'm so grateful to have been here today, to have heard the Reverend speak, as well as to have been invited to present on Empower's behalf. This is a powerful and potent subject, and I'm glad that we're, you know, lifting up the voices of people of color in this context, but also really thinking through how we can practically apply these ideals to our own work and our own day-to-day living. So thank you to all of you, and thank you for being brave and putting this topic at the fore.
Thanks to all.